Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, my guest is Carol Tracy. She's the executive director of the Women's Law Project here in Philadelphia, and she has been on the front lines of the abortion rights fight for a lot of years now. And she's helping us understand everything that's going on as abortion becomes front and center again as we enter a new political season. We're going to be talking about everything from the highly restrictive state laws that are being passed in states like Alabama and Missouri, and very pro-abortion rights laws that are being passed in states like New York. What is the future of Roe versus Wade? What is the impact on women? How do we understand this highly energized, politicized debate about abortion once again becoming front and center? This is a really great conversation with somebody who has been fighting this fight for a long time and really understands and help us understand this issue. Stay tuned. On today's episode of Good Law, Bad Law, my guest is Carol Tracy, the executive director of the Women's Law Project based right here in Philadelphia. And we're going to be talking today about arguably the most polarized issue in the country today, an issue that has been polarizing for quite a number of decades now, since Roe versus Wade in 1973. Carol, welcome. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
There's been a lot of news on abortion. With states like Georgia, Alabama passing new laws, being the most highly restrictive anti-abortion laws we've seen in this country in 50 years, and other states like New York going in the other direction and passing laws in state houses to protect the right to abortion in anticipation of what may be coming from our Supreme Court. So we're going to get into all of that and what you can help us understand about the landscape, where we're going, and what the real issues are that we need to focus on. So I'm grateful to have you here to help us with that. Give our listeners, before we jump into that, though, some background on yourself and on the Women's Law Project.
Okay. Well, let me talk about the Women's Law Project first. We are one of only 5 state-based organizations that are devoted to improving the status of women and gender, increasingly LGBT issues. We are 44 years old, and we work on a full range of what we call intersecting issues of reproductive rights and justice being the most fundamental, but also discrimination in employment, in education, in insurance. We do a great deal of work around violence against women. We've done a significant project here in Philadelphia, what we call a police accountability project, that arose out of a scandal when the police were not investigating all of the sex crimes that were reported to them. This was back in 1999. We led a reform effort, and that effort has led to an unprecedented advocate review of sex crimes files that has taken us into the national picture. So lots of our work begins locally and it becomes national in focus, either through impact litigation or through public policy work. So we like to think that, we're a relatively small organization. We also have an office in Pittsburgh, but we have a pretty big bite.
And specifically, abortion rights is part of the agenda of the Women's Law Project. Tell us about the background of your group and as far as that goes.
Well, not too long after we were founded in 1974, the Pennsylvania legislature started in the aftermath of the Roe decision of doing everything it could to outlaw abortion in Pennsylvania. So we have been to the Supreme Court challenging abortion rights twice. The first was in 1985 in a case, and then again in the landmark case, 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But throughout that time, we have worked on legislative issues. We have done everything we could to prevent the passage of what was the Abortion Control Act, the act that was
that gave rise to Planned Parenthood.
Gave rise to Planned Parenthood,
Yeah.
and also the act that wanted to overturn Roe, and ultimately led to significant restrictions. But in addition to that, we also represent abortion care providers on a whole range of regulatory issues. Pennsylvania is one of the most highly regulated states in terms of abortion care in the country. I believe we have 1,293 pages of regulations. We sometimes put all of them on a table in front of the legislature saying, we're regulated, you don't need to do any more. You've over-regulated us, in fact, and in fact they have. So we represent providers on a lot of those regulatory issues, inspection issues, and litigation. We're involved in 3 clinic protection cases right now. 2 of them are before the Third Circuit.
And what are the issues there?
Buffer zones. We have buffer zones
Okay.
In Pittsburgh and in Harrisburg. And these are just 15 feet, or in Pittsburgh, 20 feet in Harrisburg, in front of a clinic. So a person who is seeking constitutionally protected health care can walk into the clinic and not be spat on, harassed, kicked, and threatened, although they do always try to claim that they are little old ladies praying in a corner, and when the back is turned of the police or the cameras, that's when they spit in and harass people. So it's just a very small area, physical area, to allow people to enter into a clinic safely.
And when did you join the Women's Law Project?
I've been there since 1990.
Okay. And what did you do professionally before that? How did you come to this
How did I
work?
come to this? Thank you. Well, my I like to tell people that my political career began when I was in 6th grade, when Sister Ida Marie threw me out of class because I liked Elvis Presley. And I stood
What's
up
not to like?
Well,
Fucking Elvis. Come
Elvis
on.
Presley was very controversial
Yes,
when
of
I
course.
was a child.
Yes.
Thrusting one's pelvis is not something that was done. And I stood up to Sister, and my parents supported me. And the reason I like to tell that story is that when she came back to my parish when I was in high school, as you can tell, I grew up a Catholic. She apologized. And I thought, boy, that was the first confrontation with anything institutional, and I won.
That's great.
So I was pleased with that. I grew up in Chester, Pennsylvania. I didn't go to college right out of high school. I became a secretary. At that time when I graduated, there weren't very many opportunities for women. I was the youngest in the family. My brothers needed to go to college. I did the homework, a lot of one of my brothers. And eventually I wound up being a secretary at the University of Pennsylvania. And while I was there, women faculty were organizing, and I tried to organize the secretaries into a union. The women faculty took me under their wing, helped me figure out how to get a scholarship, and I then went to Penn undergrad full-time. And while I was there, was part of a women's sit-in protesting rape on campus. We held College Hall for several days and created a women's center, which I eventually came to run. And while I was running the women's center, I decided I needed to go to law school. And I went to Temple at night while I was running the women's center. While I was there was another horrendous gang rape at a fraternity that I became a whistleblower on. And anyway, I finished law school. I finished my tenure there and started practicing law. And along came my dream job. The reason I went to law school was to be the director of the Women's Law Project. So it became available, and I was lucky to get the job in 1990.
So you've seen this issue we're talking about today, the abortion issue, and been involved in the forefront of the constitutional, legal and political ways in which this issue has played out since being involved with the Women's Law Project. And I know you and I were chatting before we got started today and talked about just how much more polarized the issue seems than ever.
Yeah.
How would you describe that polarization?
Well, I think that abortion is being used as, a hammer, and it's a hammer against women's rights. I think in the pro-choice community, all of us feel very clearly that we know there are many people who would never have an abortion, who, for them personally, it would be an immoral choice, and still remain pro-choice. But we understand increasingly that this battle is not about life. This battle is about controlling the lives of adult women. If it was about life, we would not be separating babies at the border. Mm-hmm. If it was about life, we would not have the outrageously high infant mortality that we have in this country. If it was about life, we would not have the unrelenting, crushing poverty where children are hungry in this country. This is not about life. And I think we should stop pretending that it is.
Well, but there are those probably most easily identifiable as people who do have a good faith religious conviction about what life is and when life begins, who are guided by those faith-based beliefs and take the positions they take about abortion based on those views. So, I mean, I think I want to try to take some of that on, just
Sure.
right off,
and that's fine.
Because I think those are arguments people are hearing. And when they are stated in those terms, they are views that appear to come from a very strong conviction, and again, a well-intentioned or good faith based conviction. So, I know, and we're going to talk a lot about the issue of women's integrity and right to be free from control over their body. I'm a father of 3 daughters. I'm a stepfather to a stepdaughter. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. But I'm interested in what you would say to someone who comes from that good faith place. Is so breaking it down, and the Roe Supreme Court really struggled with this and kind of had to come up with some way to balance interests.
Yeah.
And goes on at great length struggling with that, in the opinion. And I encourage everyone to read it. It's in many ways a beautiful opinion and well worth reading to understand some of the background in how a Supreme Court does wrestle with this. But is it your view that a developing fetus at some point does become a life over which the state has an interest?
Yes, and that's what Casey Roe clearly says that.
Right. Okay.
The trimester framework that Roe set out was very clearly that.
Right.
First trimester, it is between entirely the woman and the physician. In the second trimester, there may be more medical intervention. Let me back up for a second and talk about the history.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Because abortion was not a crime until quickening back in the 18th century and the 19th century.
Quickening was
when the fetus was probably 5 to 6 months. Because the point of any kind of intervention there was to protect the woman's health. It was dangerous. It was dangerous to have an abortion. Abortions were not done by medical doctors, so there's a combination of issues that went on.
Well, all medical procedures were dangerous.
That's
too.
right.
Yeah.
That led to the criminalization of abortion. But it was, for the most part, it was understood, it had been part of history, that women have had abortions. Midwives were likely the people who assisted in those abortions. To the extent that there was any state intervention, it was because it became dangerous to the woman. It was not about the potential life. The two things that coincided in the late 19th century were the medicalization or men became the primary people involved in medicine. The professionalization of medicine, as they described it, which meant power was being taken away from the female healers and midwives and was actually put in the hands of male doctors. And the male doctors, there was a very clear and concerted effort to remove women from any kind of medical intervention, including pregnancy. It's a very interesting history. At some point in the late 1800s, when more and more people were being treated in hospitals, it was a point of prestige for upper middle class women to have their babies in hospitals.
Yeah.
However, we didn't know enough about sepsis then, and the infant and maternal mortality skyrocketed. It was
once they went to hospitals.
It was much safer for them to be in the hands of a midwife.
Well, and that was especially true for lower income individuals. If you had money, you had a doctor come to your house. You didn't, in the early days, you didn't go to the hospital.
So when you did go to the hospital, yes. But the point is that there was a very clear effort to get women out of the medical profession, and that was really to the detriment of the health of women. I'm sorry, I have a cold.
Yeah, I know. I'm so sorry about that too.
The second issue is there was a Postmaster General named Anthony Comstock who went on an anti-obscenity crusade. And he decided that any information in newspapers about abortion or abortifacients was a form of obscenity. So it was very common for abortion to be advertised in newspapers. Abortion was commonplace. It was not illegal. It was done by various midwives or female healers. And Mr. Comstock, in this very extensive anti-obscenity movement, included all of that information. So we had this confluence of doctors who were, in fact, doing more harm to women's health than not, but outlawing abortion because it was dangerous to the lives of women. And Anthony Comstock, who's deciding that in his anti-obscenity movement, that abortion was part of an obscene behavior and advertisements, that those two issues what led to the criminalization of abortion. Fetal life was really not discussed until much later and a good part of the 20th century.
Is that also because, I mean, certainly if you'd ask practicing Catholics, I mean, there was the idea of life beginning at conception is nothing new to Catholic doctrine, but is it also in part because religious influence in the development of law in this country, that's also a more recent phenomenon, the rise of religious conservatives seeking to implement a social policy agenda consistent with their views,
sure,
and looking to Supreme Court nominees.
Yeah.
We had Catholics on the Supreme Court, for a long time, but not in as politicized a way as it is today.
And an ideological way.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and we also had this unusual belief of the separation of religion from state, and that line has been really blurring very clearly for the last 40 years. So back to your original question, of course there are people who are morally opposed to abortion. The question is how much role does the state have in intervening and interfering and making abortion a crime? And it's always been so interesting to me, and it's still interesting in the current debate, because those who are criminalized in this are the doctors. It's as though the women are these stupid, helpless people who are incapable of making a moral decision. Right. And it is a doctor who has come in and has persuaded them to have an abortion. For what purpose, God knows, but women have no ability to make a moral decision on their own. And that among other things drives me crazy.
That's such a fascinating point. If you really want to be consistent and say a fetus is a life, and taking the life of a fetus is murder, why wouldn't you? And I'm not suggesting this should happen.
I'm with you completely.
But why shouldn't the woman be held accountable for that?
There's no consistency in this, except, controlling women. I mean, I will say that 100 times. It's fundamental. Having control over one's body is fundamental to control over one's life. It's interestingly enough, the other area that you heard me talk about that I work so much in is sexual assault. And the origins of the crimes of rape come as rape was evolved as a crime against property. And the property was the reproductive capacity of the daughter, whose virginity was transferred from her father to the man who was going to be her husband to protect patriarchal inheritance rights. Rape was a crime to protect the economic interests of men. And it's the reproductive capacity of women is really what
comes from those roots.
Comes from that, absolutely. Yeah. And it manifests itself in so many different ways. In the same way, if this is murder, certainly I think that it is essential to have rape and incest exceptions. But it's like, what are you talking about? If you are opposed to this, then be opposed to it. But all of these little innuendos,
you wouldn't make an exception.
Right. So
if it's murder, it's murder.
The women aren't going to be prosecuted. A pregnancy that is the result of rape. It just, none of it makes any sense. There's no moral consistency in it at all.
All right. So give us then your moral position on this, because this isn't purely a moral issue, because there's a constitutional component to this as well. So blending, the moral component and the constitutional component. How do you? What is your position stated consistently?
My position stated consistently is that this is a moral decision that involves the unique capacity of a woman to become pregnant, and it is her right to make decisions about her body, and that the personal privacy and autonomy has to be respected. The state does not belong in that decision.
What do you think that, just as we talked about some of the inconsistencies in the fetus is a life and therefore taking a life is murder view, exists when you think about exceptions for rape and incest, for example? On the other side, do you think that some advocates have gone too far, for instance, on the question of late-term abortion? Does that tend to strain the ability to be consistent morally on the issue from the other side?
No, I don't think it does. And sort of, what is late-term abortion? It's almost non-existent in, for example, the third trimester. To the extent that it is almost always an issue of a serious fetal anomaly. These are generally wanted pregnancies, not always, but almost always. The life of the mother might be at risk. The focus on that when we have a 6-week heartbeat ban, just again, there's just no consistency, I think, in the putting forth these kinds of arguments.
Well, I know I'm hearing a lot from my travels through the media, from those who are more conservative, so to speak, on abortion rights, even from the president himself, claiming that pro-choice advocates are pushing for a set of rules that would allow a woman to abort a baby even up to the minute before the baby is delivered.
That's actually called a delivery, or it's called a cesarean section. I think when I hate to call him the president, but when I guess he was still a candidate, and he talked about ripping a baby, that's a cesarean section. Don't talk about female anatomy if you don't know anything about it, which clearly he, in particular, does not. So those things don't happen.
Yeah.
That's what's absurd about it.
Well, and the other curious thing about what's happening on this issue overall is the number of abortions is going down. I mean, the number of abortions overall has dropped dramatically since Roe versus Wade, and we're still talking about it. And I'm not saying it's not an important issue. I mean, taking away a right is always an important issue, but as a national issue, this isn't something that is nearly as prevalent as it's been in the past.
The same opponents of abortion are opponents of birth control. What does that mean? We know exactly what that means. Now, the decline in abortion rates is generally, I think, regarded as very positive, that there are issues around birth control and that have impacted that. There's also, and we have to be really honest about it, there are far few providers than there were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And that's really what I think is the most important issue on the table right now, that while we're talking about the six-week ban or the heartbeat bans and whatever else they're coming up with that are patently unconstitutional, what has happened, and it doesn't get nearly as much attention, is states have imposed totally burdensome, unnecessary regulations on what is one of the safest medical procedures. And that is driving abortion providers out of business.
Well, and I know and we talked about this a little bit earlier, the evolution of this as a series of court decisions, starting with Roe, has led to an evolution in the way the abortion debate and the fight on the streets, and you've been fighting this fight for a long time on behalf of the providers. The way it's evolved has changed, starting with Roe versus Wade, and then the Planned Parenthood decision in 1992. But now, so let me address first the fate of Roe versus Wade, and then let's look at some of the other ways in which people are impacted by the state laws and regulations that have cropped up over the years. So first of all, as to Roe, I know you and I chatted earlier, and you said when you got involved in the Planned Parenthood case, you really thought that was the end of Roe at that time, but of course it wasn't. Right. Starting with Roe, it does seem from a constitutional point of view, and I've really wrestled with this myself for a long time, trying to understand it. There is a lot of criticism of the Roe decision in the way they reached the result, because this issue of privacy is not explicitly in the Constitution. I mean, Harry Blackman, who wrote the opinion for the court in the section dealing with the constitutional support for the findings they reached, starts that whole section of the opinion saying the Constitution does not explicitly mention any right of privacy. Do you wish there was a way that Roe could have been written with stronger foundation to it, and maybe that would have fended off some of what we've been dealing with ever since?
Well, Possibly. I mean, there are certainly scholars who have said that it would have been better framed under the equality notions of the Equal Protection Clause.
Of the 14th Amendment.
Of the 14th Amendment,
Yeah.
yes, which is where it's, privacy is in the liberty interests of privacy and liberty. There are a series of cases having nothing to do with abortion that talk about privacy and the right to be left alone by the government, and to the right of every individual to the possession and control of one's own person. So these liberty interests are securely embedded in constitutional jurisprudence. So that's there. So yeah, maybe if it was under the equality provisions, I don't think it would have changed at all the political discussion of where we are. And, as Sandra Day O'Connor talked about in Casey, women have come to live with this and come to rely on these important rights. So, we can have these theoretical arguments about whether it would be stronger, but the attack on Roe is not a legal attack. It's a political attack.
Right. Well, and the reason I ask you that and ask that we go back to the way Roe was framed by the Supreme Court back then is because part of what seems to have everybody more politicized on this issue than ever, and there was just actually a CNN poll that was reported this morning, that found that 3 of 10 in the poll say that abortion is going to be a driving decision in terms of their vote. They will only vote for a candidate who shares their views on abortion. And I think those numbers are significantly higher than they've been when that question's been asked before. And the polls of people's views, those who think abortion should be legal in all circumstances and those who think abortion should never be legal under any circumstances, those numbers are increasing. So we can see in that, assuming it's some scientifically valid to some extent, some indication that people's views are becoming more energized and animated as we come into a new political season. And I can't help thinking that's because we now have President Trump, who's put 2 conservatives on the Supreme Court, one to replace Antonin Scalia, but much more importantly, one to replace Justice Kennedy, who was a pivotal vote in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision. So I think people are thinking what's going to happen to Roe.
And with, back in 1992, though many very well-informed people thought that Roe could be overturned in Casey, I was not one of them. I thought that would just start a revolution. That's not going to happen. I no longer am in that camp. I think Roe is very much in danger. And I think that the escalation of hate and the escalation of bias that we are experiencing in so many ways in this country, for those people who, the right wing, frankly, who wanted to use abortion as a wedge issue, I think, are in the process of losing control over it.
What do you mean by that?
Because I think it was just a wedge to get people excited, to get the evangelicals on board, but not to overturn Roe, because quite frankly, there's always going to be a wealthy Republican woman who needs an abortion, or a wealthy Republican man who wants to make sure his mistress gets an abortion. Now, there's always the possibility, as in the pre-Roe days, that those people will still have access to it, that they'll find a way, but it might be a little more difficult, and they still could be facing some criminal charges, or the doctors could. So, I think keeping it out there for themselves, because what we've seen in the whittling away of Roe since that time has been The impact has been on poor people in the refusal to provide Medicaid funding or other kind of state funding for abortion.
Putting limits on clinics.
The regulations on clinics are extraordinary. The issues related to teenagers. You don't have to have your parents' permission to have a baby. You don't have to have your parents' permission to have a C-section. So the numbers of restrictions that have been placed, really the burden falls on the less wealthy, the less connected, those who are furthest away from major metropolitan areas. So, I think that we have seen that whittling away that's going to harm the less fortunate, the most vulnerable, but still wanting to protect the right for those who are considered worthy of rights in this country. So, but I think that those who used it that way have lost control over it.
Well, it's interesting when you think about the way law may evolve, even in areas of constitutional law and the development of a right. You do look at the way that our courts or our legislature has acted in ways over time. There's a development in the law, the jurisprudence, we say, in a particular area of law. Here, there's really nothing big. There hasn't been really any major constitutional movements when it comes to abortion, but there have been major political and social forces that seem to be moving this issue. And is that what you're basing your concerns about as to the future of Roe? Because it's not the changing law, it's the changing politics.
Without a doubt. And I will tell you, I've also talked to people in our movement, people who have been very engaged in supporting abortion rights. And sometimes people will say, maybe we ought to have Roe overturned, and then we'll get it back, and we'll get back what we fully need. I can't go that far personally. I want to hold on, but there's little doubt that it has become more of a theoretical right than a genuine right for people in many parts of this country.
Well, what would that even look like? I mean, if Roe is overturned, it doesn't mean abortion would then become illegal across the country. It means we would be looking to these very widely diverging state laws.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
And I just pulled it so we can, know this, but it's not just Alabama that we've heard a lot about in recent weeks, but I think there are 7 altogether. Here it is. Alabama's new law restricts abortion completely, only allowing an exception for when the woman's life is threatened. But Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Ohio have passed 6-week bans, no abortion after 6 weeks, and Missouri has passed an 8-week law. So that's a lot of parts of the country that have already acted through their legislatures, obviously anticipating or perhaps trying to provoke the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. And that's one look at what things would look like in a world if Roe is overturned. But what are the people you talk to imagining would happen if Roe is overturned, and that certainly there would be a social and political upheaval, I would imagine.
Well,
but then what?
I think those legislatures will be overturned as well. I mean, I don't think the population is going to put up with this. I really don't. And I hope, for the sake of people who are living in Georgia and Ohio and Kentucky and Mississippi, that they can find the political clout. Of course, these are states where there's a lot of gerrymandering. I think there, if Roe is overturned, I think that it will be just such an extraordinary event in this country that it will really be hard to predict all of the manifestations of it. But women simply aren't going back. And it's not just going to be women who live in New York or California or Illinois. Women throughout this country have come to understand this, to rely on it, to do everything they can to prevent it, for sure, but will not have that right taken away for them. And, the polls also show how many men support Roe. How many men like yourself have daughters, have wives. Things happen. Lots of things happen that are unplanned, that could have severe medical complications, that even under the best of circumstances, if you are either abstinent or on birth control, things happen in the lives of women, and people understand that. And while we're talking so much about women, there is no question that huge numbers of men are in support of this. And we also understand that increasingly, and we talk about it a lot, we talk about pregnant people, that there's a transgender community also that is affected by all of this. I mean, a lot of the gay rights that we have in this country have evolved from reproductive rights law. So,
well, Justice Kennedy, who wrote the same-sex marriage decision and was instrumental in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey, you can hear in the language that he uses the dignity of individual freedom and choice. Absolutely. And almost in a religiously reverential way, talking about the sanctity of our most fundamental selves, and
that's right,
wanting to prevent government intrusion into that.
Yeah. And I think that we will always come back to the question, of course there are people who won't have abortions, and there are people who will risk their lives rather than have an abortion. They should have that right. We don't want to be China. We don't want to get to a place where people insist on people having an abortion. Yeah. That's not where we are. That's not the kind of life we want to have. But we have to let people make these choices about their bodies and their lives without the government.
Well, I've often wondered why the more libertarian-minded, elements of the conservative end of the political spectrum, so to speak, why libertarians don't have a greater problem with the idea of this not being something that is left up to the individual to decide, up to the woman to decide. Yeah. Because it is the ultimate state intrusion in the most fundamental and most private of decisions.
That's correct. I think
but it's unique. I mean,
it's unique. It's unique to women, and it's unique to women's role and position in society, and that's what it's all about. It has become so highly politicized in an attempt, I think, to roll back the rights of women in every sphere of their life.
Well, I know we've spent a lot of time focusing on Roe, and it certainly may also be that Roe is left in place, but greater state restrictions in a variety of different ways becomes increasingly the norm, allowed by the Supreme Court, even under some preservation of Roe's basic idea. So I wanted to leave a couple minutes for you to talk about that too, because I know you've done a lot of work in that area. And again, when we chatted, you talked about, for instance, there being vast wastelands in Pennsylvania, obviously in other parts of the country too, where this really is an issue of access to healthcare for women. So other than the core fundamental right, or not having that fundamental right to an abortion, what are the other ways in which this has played out since Casey?
Well, I think the most important way is the overregulation of a very, very safe healthcare proceeding, and I think that will continue. I mean, part of what is going on now, I think, is actually really important. This discussion, this getting on the table that people want to ban an abortion at 6 weeks, that potential life has more gravitas than the life of the adult woman is something that's on the table. And we haven't discussed it quite as robustly as we are now. Not since prior to Roe. And even then, it wasn't as politicized as it is now. It wasn't discussed as much as it is now. So it's horrifying in many ways, particularly for people who are living in those states that have such awful restrictions. I mean, we are very lucky in Pennsylvania that we have Governor Wolf. And this last election gave us a much larger margin to uphold his veto than we had in the prior election.
You're talking about the Pennsylvania State House.
Pennsylvania State House, yes.
Picked up some seats for the Democrats.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, it's not just, and it at this point, it has become such a partisan issue. It's so absurd that abortion is a Democratic or Republican position. Particularly back 20 years ago, some of our strongest allies were Republicans. It's kind of what happened. Why did that change?
What did happen?
Right. That's probably another show
Right.
with people more experienced in political analysis than me. But I think that as threatening as it is, that it's a discussion that we've got to reach some decision in this country.
Well, what do you do then with? I mean, there's clearly a greater attention, energy, as you say, a more robust discussion happening across the country now, perhaps than we've seen in a long time. What do you, as an advocate on these issues, do with that energy? How do you frame the issue to take advantage of that issue, that energy?
Well, I think we keep talking about it. I think that we participate in as many conversations as we can. It's not that there has been silence around this issue, because clearly there has not been. But the degree to which it is being discussed now requires more civic engagement. It requires, I think that, you know, some of the people who have been leading the Indivisibles, for example, are baby boomers. Baby boomers remember when abortion was illegal. They have daughters and granddaughters and sons who, you know, may not be prepared to be fathers. So I think that the intergenerational discussion is going on and has to go on. And it's like anything else that if we are silent about it, then we lose too much momentum. And I think that those who are moving these really regressive agendas, in many respects, I think are doing it at their peril, because I think that the population, I just don't think it. The polls all tell us that there are far more people who believe in a woman's right to have an abortion.
Even in states like Alabama? And
Even in
Missouri?
states like Alabama and Georgia, absolutely.
So maybe they ought to be careful what they ask for here.
Oh, I think they ought to be very careful about what they ask for. And this conversation is long overdue. And the misuse of abortion as a political tool is something that we really need to be talking about. You know, it is a private, personal decision that a woman needs to make with her family and with her loved ones in the context of good, appropriate health care. And it's on the continuum of health care. And we can't forget the mistreatment of pregnant women, the mistreatment of poor children in this country as part of that conversation. Life can't only be sacred in the womb, you know, and that really has to be on the table. And I think it is becoming more and more on the table. Ultimately, I would not be able to do the work I do if I didn't have some optimism. I am more concerned than I have ever been with the Supreme Court as it stands. I think that that proactive states are doing really good things to protect that right, something that probably should have been done immediately in the aftermath of Roe, but it's taking place now. I think it will take longer for places like Georgia and Ohio to come on board, but it's going to happen. Women will not go back to the dark ages. It's not going to happen. It just is not going to happen. And their male partners aren't going to let it happen either.
And their fathers and
their fathers,
their husbands,
their friends. It's not going to happen.
Carol Tracy, Executive Director of the Women's Law Project, it's been a pleasure to have you here. And thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.